Greetings, TED community. So good to see you. Welcome to the latest of our daily live conversations in these weird days of the virus. Good to have you with us, whether you're sitting isolated at home, maybe with a loved one or with family. Maybe you're by yourself. Maybe you have symptoms. Our hearts go out to you. Maybe you've lost someone. Maybe you know medical workers on the front line and you're worried for them. Or maybe you think this whole thing is a sort of trumped up panic by the media. Whoever you are, you're welcome here for this next hour. I think it's going to be an important conversation. Every morning the first sort of news headline I look at is not a headline, it's a graph. There's a site, worldometer.info, that has graphs. I want to show you the graph for today. Here's what it looks like. I don't know if you can see this. I hope you like the super high-tech production values here, by the way. That is not a pretty graph. That is what exponential growth looks like. More than 60,000 new cases outside China today. And in the last 2 days, in the whole time in China that this was raging, they notched up about 80,000 cases on the official numbers. The world outside China in the last 2 days has had well over 100,000 cases. And US is now number one. The nation where this was supposed to go away really quickly now has more cases than anywhere else in the world. It's like 85,000 and growing fast. New York, where I'm sitting, where the whole TED team is based, is the epicenter in the US. So it's a scary time to be here in New York. There are some truly horrible stories coming out of some of the hospitals that are in danger of getting overrun. Huge efforts being made there, but and of course, in many other parts of the world, we've heard some of the darker stories that are out there. So it's an alarming time, and like anyone who looks at the numbers understands what exponential growth is. It's an alarming time. There will be days in the coming couple of weeks where 60,000 new cases in a day will seem wonderfully good news. The numbers are going to go higher. And so I suspect we're in this for a long time to go. Basically, for many of us, just our lives completely different from what they normally are. Many of us isolated in some form or other at home. And in a way, we're the lucky ones. There's others who can't afford to do that, who are having to go out to work somehow, makes some kind of living, and in doing so may feel that they're putting themselves at risk. So these are hard days, and we're going to have to get used to a bunch of new ways to be and new ways to connect with each other, because we can't actually be isolated. We're human beings, we're a social species. We have to connect with other people. We just have to. And thankfully, there are many ways that it is still possible to do that, many beautiful ways and ways that we're discovering. And we're going to spend this hour devoted to that and thinking about that. So I'd like to invite on my co-host, Whitney Pennington Rodgers, as current affairs curator. Whitney, hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what you've shared, just how we can and really stay connected, which I think is so important for us. And so, we're bringing you an interview today with Priya Parker. She's the author of The Art of Gathering, and her work really focuses on how we can develop and really sustain those meaningful connections. And she's sharing some insight onto how we can continue to have gatherings that are intentional and add great value to our lives during the pandemic. As Chris mentioned, on the point of connection, we had some connectivity issues that would have made it really challenging for us to invite Priya to do this interview live. So we pre-recorded it, and we really are looking forward to seeing what you all share about your own experiences with creating these connections. And so we took a lot of value from this and look forward to hearing what your thoughts are, and hope that this is something that you enjoy listening to.
Well, thank you, especially given the special accommodations you had to make. Thank you so much for making the time for this. And I think especially about as we're having a conversation about connection, this feels somehow really, really related and relevant. It seems like it makes a lot of sense that we're talking about how we can have connections in these trying times and create creative ways to do that. And I think before we jump into this conversation a little bit more, I'd love to just talk a little bit first about your own background. So you are the author of a book called The Art of Gathering, and you think a lot about how we can have meaningful connections, create meaningful gatherings. But you're not an event planner. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the lens through which you approach gathering.
Sure. So I'm a group conflict resolution facilitator. I'm trained in the methodology of group dialogue. So basically, how do you bring together a group of people, 3 or more, though I'm often doing it with 12 people or 40 people or 300 people in a room, and have meaningful conversation, meaningful dialogue that actually creates a different outcome for that community based on how you structure the conversation. And I wrote this book, The Art of Gathering, in part because I was frustrated by kind of what popular culture tells us about what creates magic between people, which if you kind of boil it down very simply, it's like if you get the things right, if you get the fish knives right, or if you get the food right, or if you get the tablecloth right, everything else will take care of itself, that magic will happen through people because of the luck of their chemistry. And I know as a trained facilitator that that's just not true. And going to gathering after gathering in all types of contexts, at schools, in the public square, conferences, birthday parties, I would get really frustrated seeing hosts take a lot of time and a lot of care and a lot of love, pouring their time and energy into broadly stuff that doesn't really matter, or at least doesn't actually make connection and intimacy and meaning and transformation among people. It creates beauty, but it doesn't necessarily create connection. And I wanted to bring the facilitator's lens to how anybody, regardless of where you are, you don't need a fancy house, you don't need the right fish knives, you don't need a specific, computer program, how anybody can create meaning with the people in their lives, at work, at home, in their community, or in the public square.
That's great. And it seems like, that's something that now more than ever, we need to be really thoughtful about that. And I'm curious, you started to talk about this a little bit, about people really focusing more on visually what these gatherings look like. I mean, do you feel like collectively we really struggled with how to create meaningful gatherings even before we got to this moment with the coronavirus?
I think that many of our gatherings aren't up to snuff in terms of being memorable and transformative to the people in them. And I think this is for a lot of different reasons. I think one of the things that I studied were rituals that actually create transformation in people. And powerful rituals tend to be specific. And specificity tends to come from sub-communities. So for example, like Tamilian Brahminian red thread tying ceremonies. There's a very specific ceremony for a very specific community, or Javanese like tooth filing ceremonies where there's a specific act and the people part of that gathering or part of that community understand like the symbolic act of each thing. They worship the same God, they eat the same things, they dress in the same way. And as we've become globalized and diverse and modern in a lot of different ways, I would argue all good things, many of our gatherings, in part to try to not offend one another or assume that we share the same beliefs, have become vague and diluted. And so part of what we're struggling with, even well before this, with this pandemic, is when people are coming together to mark a specific occasion or to meet in a specific way, we tend to understructure and give less context and underhost our gatherings in a way that actually creates meaning among people who don't all share the same beliefs.
That's great. I mean, and I think that it's, now that we are in this moment and we're spending so much more time apart from one another physically, it seems like, thinking about how we can stay in touch and how we can stay connected in a meaningful way, that creates, of course, a new challenge. But it sounds like it's much more than just staying in touch with each other. So, I mean, how should we change the lens of how we think about gatherings now that we are in this moment with this pandemic?
So we don't know how long this will last, and the biggest mistake we make, whether you're gathering online or off, is we tend to assume that the purpose is obvious. We tend to assume that if you're having a work meeting, it's to discuss work, or if you're having a birthday party, it's to mark a birthday. And in this time specifically, the biggest way to actually create a meaningful gathering for your community is to first ask, what is the need? Like, what is the need for this specific community at this specific moment in time? And one of the things I've been watching is as you know, gathering after gathering is getting postponed or canceled, the ones that are trying to figure out how to make their offline gathering online need to pause and actually ask, given this new reality, what is the need my community now needs? And not assume that the gathering online should look exactly the same way as it did offline, just sticking a video camera in front of one another. If you're a teacher and you're trying to figure out how to teach a course that is, you have always taught with people physically, your students physically in the room, to actually pause and not say, is my purpose to teach math? Perhaps the purpose now for the next multiple weeks is to give confidence to your students to keep trying through the mechanism of math. I'm kind of making this up here, but part of what the key of all of these gatherings as we're coming together to make them meaningful is to actually pause and to not assume we know what the need is or we know what the purpose is, and to begin by asking first, for the specific community, for my family or for my friends or for my cousins or for my group of activists or for my board members or for my neighbors, this week, this day, what is it that we most need and how might we gather around that? Or for some people who are getting zoomed out, Zoom call after Zoom call after Zoom call, the need might actually be to cancel a gathering. So I'm not saying gather more, I'm saying gather better.
And it seems that doing that also would be different for those people who maybe we're living with or, are isolating with, and those who are not actually physically spending time with. So I guess how should we think about those connections differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, many of us are isolating with family members or roommates or partners. Some of us are alone. And most of us are also finding ways to be connected with those we're not with. So I'll first start with the communities if you're isolating within, which is a couple of things. In conflict resolution, one of the first things you do as a facilitator is create ground rules. I think of as every gathering as an opportunity for an interruption, and we right now are in the greatest moment of global interruption we've faced in a long time. And one of the opportunities for an interruption that this allows is when, for those that you're, quarantining with, whether they're the people you normally regularly live with, or whether that you're an adult and you've gone home to your adult parents, and you're renegotiating what it actually looks like to live together during this period when you weren't expecting it, is to actually first pause and create some ground rules. You don't have to call it that, but for some ground rules to say, how do we want to live together? How do we want to be together? Do we want to have specific evenings a week where we come together and we have dinner, and the rest of the week we're on our own? How do we want to actually share food? And to not assume that you kind of have to be together the whole time, all the time, but to actually have clear, honest conversations to navigate both physical and psychological and interconnected space together. And then once you've done that, I think the second thing around those who are isolating and creating meaningful gatherings together at home is to really think about, there's this in my book, I talk about the Passover principle, which is the first question. I'm not Jewish, but studied many different types of gatherings in my research. And one of the questions that Jews ask during Passover Seder, the first question is roughly translated as, how is this night different than all other nights? And I think that is a question that is so powerful and is applicable to every gathering you've ever hosted. So as you're home with your family or with your friends or with your partner, to begin to ask, how do you begin to mark the days so that they don't all blend in with each other? What is Tuesday evening? How do you want to come together? Could you, set up a list of questions of questions you would never, typically ask one another at a normal evening. But how do you actually come together and answer the, 34 questions to fall in love with anybody questions, or find a way to have conversations with your parents or with your grandparents that normal times don't allow for. And then to your second point around how do we create meaning or connection with those with whom we're not with, there are, at some level, it's sort of the same question, which is map out your communities and ask what do they need and what do you need? And in some cases, it might be just a simple kind of passive experiencing something together through connecting and kind of sync watching something. So like the Metropolitan Opera every night is doing live streams of their operas around, online. There's many types of cultural and art institutions that are actually making free a lot of their content. And so at kind of a low participation rate, but just kind of wanting to do something together, the equivalent of going to watch the movies, you can actually sync watch these things together. At a higher level of engagement, one of the forms of meaning making is to actually think about what are the conversations, or how do you want to engage with one another through either a shared activity or a sharing activity over this course of time. When in 2012, Bruce Springsteen gave this amazing talk at South by Southwest where he basically kind of gave a musical autobiography. So like the songs that most shaped him as a 7-year-old, as a 13-year-old, as a 19-year-old, as a 23-year-old. It's one of the most amazing speeches you can ever read, and you can look it online. I've actually, this is like what a nerd I am, I've like read through the speech and then just played each song on Spotify to kind of like have the experience. And I was telling this to a friend, and he said, why don't we do that as a circle of friends over a series of dinners? We, in my case, it's a group of friends who know each other pretty well, and we can kind of get into the same rut when we hang out. It's great, but it was sort of this idea of an interruption in the way that how do we actually have a different kind of conversation? And so we made up the rules, and we called it 7 songs. And the invitation was that each person gets one evening, one dinner, one salon, where they come and they bring the 7 songs that most shape them over the course of their life, their full life. And the rest of us would agree to kind of listen to them and also to the songs. And there's no reason you couldn't do that virtually. And so when I say create meaning together, meaning is created through specificity and structure. And around a specific purpose. And so in this moment in time when we're not sure how long we'll be social distancing, or at least physically distancing, to find really interesting forms of interruptions among friends and families to say, how do we actually want to use this time together? And to have perhaps conversations that we typically wouldn't have in this kind of different moment.
Wow, I love that. And I love how it seems like there's so many ways that we can take the events that we already have, or the ways that we've already been connecting, and really just modify them and adapt them to this situation that we're living in. So one thing I'm curious about, you sort of mentioned this at the beginning of your response and thinking about the ground rules. I'd love to talk a little bit too about, what might some of those ground rules look like when we're thinking about how we're connecting and gathering with folks, as you mentioned, in some cases where maybe you're isolating together, but maybe that whole living experience is different. That if you're maybe an adult child who's moving home, what does that look like? How do you create those ground rules so that you can connect meaningfully, gather meaningfully in a space that maybe is very different from what your living situation was like before?
Ground rules help us create a common social contract to be able to enjoy each other. So the first thing is people often think like, ugh, rules, but actually there are implicit norms that we're sort of navigating implicitly around each other, and often fights come up because our norms clash or our expectations clash. And so before even having a conversation around sort of ground rules, to answer questions together like, how do we want to think about who uses what space when? And depending on the physical infrastructure of your house, that might be rotating through. There might be one room and one office, then 6 different people wanting to use it. It might be who gets to use the kitchen at different times. So norms around physical space, asking questions around, are there times where we would like to actually, like, how much together time do we each want or need, and how much like apart time do we each want or need? I know that in some families and extended families, there's sort of this norm that when you come together, whether it's Thanksgiving or whether it's, Easter or Passover, there's a sense that, well, we're never actually together, so you kind of do everything together all day long, right? You eat every meal together. And it's easy to kind of fall back into the routine of what it's like when you suddenly go home. But this time is very different than that. And so part of this is sort of zooming back, and particularly with adult children within their parents, to begin to ask, what are all of our individual and collective needs? And then how do we begin to navigate and orient around this moment? Other types of conversations to have potentially is financially. Are we sharing costs around certain things? How do we think about if somebody wants to spend money on something that's shared and somebody else doesn't want to have it? Like, how do we want to think about that? What are rules around quarantining? This is an inherently relational disease, right? That's what a pandemic is. And so what are the rules around which we agree to enter or exit or procure food, and to basically, relationships, many of us are being put into a situation that we weren't expecting. And one of the best ways, again, to begin to navigate that and not just have it be a defensive time, but a generative time or a creative time with those with whom you're sharing space, is to talk about it early and often and begin to hear about what are our individual needs, what are our collective needs. And you can also make it fun. But this is, living together creates a context in which it's better to talk about how you want to navigate it first, and not just kind of the hygiene of it, but also then how do we want to actually come together during this time and use it differently.
I love that. And I mean, I guess also in thinking about it from the work perspective, you talked about, not getting zoomed out, but maybe it's the reverse, it sounds like, where you might come from a space where you're constantly seeing your coworkers in person day to day, for those people who are working remotely now. And the dynamic of how you gather in those situations also seem like they might change and benefit from some rules around what those gatherings look like. I guess, what are some unique things that you think people might face in their work lives as a result of social distancing when it comes to gathering?
Absolutely. I think it raises an entire new set of questions. I mean, to be clear, there are many global companies that have already been doing distributive teaming for decades. The disabled community has very interesting and has long been advocating for simple things like live streaming, let alone thinking about digital participatory ways of coming together. So this is not new for everybody. And it's new in this scale for most of us. And I think some of the things that the sort of the first week, at least in the US context, but the cycles of weeks, is it's putting us in a situation where all of a sudden questions of intimacy come up. So, for example, for many of us, we're showing sides of ourselves. This is an example of that we wouldn't normally share. And in a work context, that could be meaning having your colleagues see your kitchen, or that could be having your colleagues see your child or your dog, or whatever it is that typically you would actually, in a work context, have the power to choose to show. And so I think the questions of intimacy are ones that are going to come up. And intimacy for intimacy's sake, particularly in a power context, isn't necessarily a good thing. But within a conscious setup, intimacy to actually bring people into this moment together and not pretend that this isn't strange is also helpful. So, for example, questions that team leaders and people hosting calls should think about is, do you purposely want to have people actually just have a white background in the back as a relative equalizer? Or do you want to purposely invite people to put the camera in front of a part of their home that is meaningful to them? And one isn't right or wrong, but just to be really thoughtful about what are you asking people to share and what are you asking people to hide or allowing them to keep for themselves. We have different spaces for different reasons, and that's a good thing. And so part of what's happening in this moment is when you're allowing, because the technology that we have is penetrating into spaces that usually we have more choice whether or not we want to share.
And so it sounds like a big part of that is really just having those conversations with each other about what makes the most sense for that particular group.
That, and I think the host, and particularly the person who has power in the context, to really think about what is the purpose of this gathering? Who needs to be there? And what is the need that we're trying to fulfill? And how do I temporarily equalize people? So the role of a host, I believe, you have three roles as a host. The first is to connect people to the purpose of the meeting and to each other. The second is to protect them from each other. And the third is to temporarily equalize them. And in some contexts, temporarily equalizing people might mean showing your background. And in other contexts, temporarily equalizing them means don't show the background because of the stark difference or imbalance between the people in the room. And I think part of the responsibility to host a gathering should not fall equally across a spectrum of power. And so a boss should really think about what is needed and how do I set my people up so that they're able to focus on the need at hand. I'll take one more second and just say, I think another question that's coming up quite often is, when do you cancel, when do you postpone, and when do you just bring it on Zoom?
Yes.
And again, for a host to say, for the person who's really thinking about the need of the community, to say, well, what is essential in this moment in time, and who needs to be a part of that, and to not assume that every person has to be part of every Zoom meeting, but also to not assume that everything that you were going to do anyway still needs to happen. There was a I think it became a New Yorker cartoon, but a joke going around that said something like, I guess that work meeting really could have just been put in an email. So there will be some gatherings that are canceled, and we will be better for it. And then there will be other gatherings that are invented, and we will be better for it.
I love that, and I just love how this is such a creative moment. It sounds like, and I'm curious. I mean, you've already shared some examples of ways that you can turn some of the meetings and gatherings that you've already had, and sort of adapt them to this moment. But I'd love to hear too. What are some, I guess, unique ways that you think really it just applies to the moment we're living in? That this is the kind of gathering that only can happen as we're all, spending so much time apart, as we're all connecting virtually, or whatever the circumstance is. What are gatherings that feel really unique to this moment?
One of the ones that I've been watching that's been written about a lot is a DJ called D Nice. Last Wednesday, he started basically DJing sets from 6 p.m. to midnight, 6 hours at a time, Eastern Standard Time. And Friday night, a number of kind of famous artists joined joined the party. And then Saturday night, it just kind of took off in this kind of electric way. Over 100,000 people joined through Instagram Live. And at some point, people from all around the world, but also a lot of political leaders in the U.S. kind of joined in, came out. Bernie Sanders came in, Elizabeth Warren made a cameo, Michelle Obama came in, and that kind of collective moment of people all dancing in their own living room or wherever they are, but being able to come into a virtual club, it reminded me of Studio 54. Andy Warhol was once asked about his red, the red rope, and why it was referred to at it was like a dictatorship to get in, no one could get in. And he said it's a dictatorship at the door, so we can have a democracy on the dance floor. And D Nice's experiment to me was that, except it didn't need to be a dictatorship at the door. And I think that is unique to this time. It was a democracy at the door, and it was a democracy on the dance floor. And I think people are experimenting in all sorts of ways of how they can meaningfully gather. There's a work context, which a lot of people, I think most of us, have lost unexpected forms of income by actually having to not be able to provide a service in person. That's particularly true of in-person gathering-based businesses like restaurants or in-person speed dating companies, yoga instructors, all types of people who rely on in-person connections to for their livelihood. And I think one thing that you're seeing is people who kind of always in the back of their head thought, yeah, I should probably have, Instagram live sessions, or I should probably figure out how to do this online. This is kind of a forcing mechanism to do that. And you can see everyday experiments from dance studios like Forward Spaces to, virtual choirs rehearsing. I think they're called the Sofa Singers. Every week, once a week on Sundays, Casper ter Kuile is having something called Sunday Sing-alongs. The Resistant Revival Chorus is also experimenting with how can they also have chorus rehearsals, choir rehearsals, but also have others participate. People are trying a lot of radical experiments around how do you actually be together apart, and how do we use these technologies to do it. I had a friend who texted me a picture of she threw a surprise birthday party for her mother over on Zoom. And to me, it was also, we're experimenting how to get online. In part, this is an intergenerational experiment. So in that case, most of her mother's friends weren't on Zoom. And so part of the act of love was her having to go and getting each friend and texting them and explaining them how to download the app, and then getting online, and then having her mother's partner say, hey, honey, come walk over here on the laptop. I think there's a show I think you might want to watch. And she walks over, and then he, opens up the screen, and all of her friends are sitting there on these tiny little squares saying surprise. And so I think we're experimenting around how do we actually be together apart in a moment where we have some of the technology that other generations couldn't have imagined, but we haven't necessarily thought about using it in this way.
That's great. I mean, and I think that makes me wonder too, just what does this mean for the future? When we come out of this, do you think that there's going to be a real shift in the way we think about how we gather?
I hope so. I think that there will be some gatherings that will go by the wayside. I think some work meetings that are canceled that nobody misses, and but we're kind of we were too weak to end before, or for political reasons, will go and no one will mention them again, and we will be better for it. I think that there will be certain gatherings that will be preserved or come back, kind of in full force, because we realize how much we value those gatherings. There was a beautiful piece a couple of days ago. I think it was a video that went viral online. And then I believe the New York Times wrote about it, of the Irish wake. And there's certain, there are certain communities that already have, as I said at the beginning of this call, deeply powerful embedded rituals in specific subcommunities. And there are certain communities that actually are very sophisticated collective gatherers. And the Irish wake is one of those examples of people actually coming physically together, people marking death, and also remembering and singing songs together, and actually gathering around the wake. And in a moment where, because of physical distancing, that's no longer possible, one family created this ritual, this idea that as they drove their mother's body to the graveyard, neighbors came out and stood 6 feet apart to basically pay their respects. And I think that's it's a beautiful example of a temporary invention of how do we remember and how do we think about honoring, because the desire and the need is so deep that even if we can't do it in the way that we usually do it, we can actually invent ways that still allow for that collective witnessing and marking and holding to happen. And then I think that a big change after this period, this pandemic, is our assumption of what we can do virtually, and what do we actually crave to be together and want to do together, and then what actually is okay to do apart. And I think we'll become much more sophisticated at using tools that have that are popping up in all sorts of contexts, digital tools, to be able to do certain things apart. And then I think we will also be very, very grateful to be back together again.
Well, it's really nice. I mean, because you don't sound fearful. I guess that this moment is going to ruin the way that we stay connected. It sounds like you have a really optimistic approach to this, and that in many ways it sounds like it might be a good thing that we're kind of going through this.
I wouldn't say it's a good thing that we're going through this. I think that this is
yes,
a global crisis.
right.
I think that I think that like any pandemic, this affects different communities differently. I think that this is very dangerous for communities that are already isolated. I think that this will exacerbate social and economic inequality as it already is. And I think, there's been a discussion, we are in a gathering recession. And I think the question is whether or not we can stave off the loneliness boom. If we can do things that allow us that even during this time of very dire, straits, if we can find inventive ways to still get through this together. And I think I think it's a massive interruption. And anytime there's a massive interruption, it allows all of us to pause and to ask the questions, well, why do we do this in the first place? And I think that's powerful.
Thank you. And thank you for clarifying. Of course, I agree that I don't think this is a good thing, but I instead meant an opportunity. It seems like it presents an opportunity for us to reflect, and that seems to be a positive element of this. So thank you for that. And I think I'd love to also. Oh, go ahead, Priya.
Sorry, I'll just say one more thing. I think the way we gather is contagious, meaning we define how and what we gather around. If somebody all of a sudden decides to have a birthday party in a very different way, not only is it kind of fun and interesting for the people in that birthday party, but every guest leaves thinking, maybe I could do my birthday party a different way. Or, maybe a funeral doesn't have to look that way. Or, maybe a meeting doesn't have to look that way. And, one of the things that's contagious during this time also is courage. And one of the reasons I love collecting all of these different stories and inventions of how people are coming together and being extraordinarily creative about it is in part to give each other ideas and inspiration. And one of the things I would ask if those who are watching to send me the examples that you're seeing, and particularly the examples that you're creating yourself, because it actually gives us hope and ideas of how we can all do this differently. I actually send out a weekly newsletter of examples from around the world of how we're actually gathering together apart. And I don't know if you can, it's priyaparker.com if you want to send me emails or examples of gathering ideas that you've been seeing that have been moving, because we all decide how we want to gather and we inspire each other by trying to do it differently.
That's great. That's great. And that sounds like, in thinking about resources folks might look for if they just decide they want to try and implement some of these examples you shared or some of the things you've suggested. That seems like that's a great way for them to do some of that. So thank you. I'd love to. We had some audience members who sent in questions in advance to ask you, and so I'd love to dive into a few of those, which I think might be really interesting. So one question from our audience was, what tips would you offer to meaningfully engage with family or friends who can't access virtual spaces, like grandparents, those who might have disabilities or impairments, or those who just may not have strong connectivity issues in terms of internet and phone? How could you stay connected with those folks?
It's a beautiful question. A couple of things. One is if they have a phone line, and that's a big if, but if they have a phone line, a landline, ways to, one, regularly call and create some kind of moment that they look forward to. There are other types of rituals from other communities. I've been told that German theater groups have a practice where they come together and read a book aloud, like one book aloud until they're done with it. So like over the course of 15 hours, communities come together and one person reads a chapter and you pass it around and you eat and you drink and you basically read an entire book together. And you can absolutely do that by like dialing in the person who can't necessarily zoom in, but to read together on the phone. If for communities or for people who are completely isolated digitally or through technology, to find ways, at least for the time being, to send them letters. Like, one of the things we're starting to see is to go back to things like why we knit, why we make bread, why we learn to create the things that we do without the help from the outside world, and to find ways to perhaps pass objects or pass letters. But for those who if there's no way in and no way out, I think that's one of the communities that I was talking about that's actually that's a very high risk.
So another really great question we had was, how can you get a sense for the feel, the energy in the room when we're not physically in the same space? What are some ways that we can recreate those connections and that bond when we're connecting from apart?
This is one of the harder parts about being apart, because we have to, at some level, create it in our mind psychologically together, and then also create that physical feeling, with one's own body without actually sharing space with others around the room. So a couple of tips. The first is, give your gathering a name. And, don't just call it meeting, or don't just call it birthday party, call, or dinner party, call it the worn out mom's hootenanny, or call it the 7-song salon, or call it the dance until you drop disco. I mean, again, I'm making this up, but part of what names do is that they're acts of social priming to get people actually into a specific psychological and physical space. And so give your gathering a name. The gathering starts from the moment of discovery, meaning from the moment that the guest actually understands, oh, this is something I can look forward to. The second is, have people bring some kind of physical object or show some kind of physical object on their side of the screen. Whether it's starting with, asking everybody to bring a vessel with a favorite drink inside, depending on your time zone, and then share a story about where they got that coffee mug from. Third is, and this sounds kind of simple, but remind people that they have a body, meaning like they themselves have a body. And that could mean, that could happen in a number of different ways, but whether it means having them actually be showing their, like, more of than just their head, but actually like the entire torso, though that also again go, if you remember the earlier part around intimacy, you decide what you're optimizing for, and invite people to also bring a physical object and put it within the frame of the video. We may not be able to be physically together, but audio is a really powerful connector. And so whether it's playing a song or inviting somebody to choose a favorite song that they want to share with the group, or some kind of, again, audio response to begin a moment with, can also kind of just help you unify people. But the feel of the physical connection, being in a group, being in a room, is one of those things that I think we will be deeply craving after this period.
And, you talked a lot about the workplace, you talked a lot about home. And another really great question that we have from our audience is about the number of children and students who are now, learning remotely. And what are some tips, I think, for educators and even for parents to try and create these meaningful gatherings for children?
Yep. So first is, particularly as an educator, to really ask, what is the deepest need now? What is it that I'm trying to teach my students? And at the deeper level, like, what is the purpose of this class? And I'll use the example of my mother-in-law, who's an educator, and she's a ceramics teacher. She teaches in a form that is deeply physical, right? And you actually need certain materials, a kiln, clay. And she now has to figure out how to teach ceramics for the next many weeks, virtually. And so she paused and she said, what is the purpose of my class? Is it to teach students ceramics? And she realized, no, ceramics is her medium, but the deeper purpose is twofold. One is to is to help her students, her art students, have a relationship with multi-dimensional art. So not just flat art, not just photography or painting, but multi-dimensional. And then the second is, she told me the other day, it's to give her students a sense that they can create something from nothing. And so she thought about it, and in her case, what she decided to do over the course of the next multiple weeks is change her curriculum to teach these two lessons through paper mache and found objects in the home. And I love this example in part because for each of us, whatever we're trying to do as educators or parents is to pause and to ask, like, what is the need of these students, or what is the need of these children now? And to look at the people in front of you, but to also ask your own deeper mission or purposes, like, why do I do this? And given the constraints now, how should I structure this gathering now, given these new constraints, so that I can still achieve my purpose? But the activity may actually look very different.
That's great. And I think also, and you've touched on some of this too, like great smaller ways that you can sort of break the ice with folks and really find a path into these great connections virtually and apart. And so somebody asked, that they said they're organizing a digital birthday party, and they were just curious for ways to bring people together who maybe don't know one another. So how can you connect with people who you had no connection with before entering these digital events and gatherings?
I actually think this is an opportunity where virtual gatherings can help, depending on how you structure it. So at many birthday parties, people come together and don't know each other and leave not knowing each other. I mean, maybe they said hello or met one person out of like 40 people they don't know. But I actually think in a context where you kind of have to like play turbo host, this is an opportunity and an excuse to have people actually meaningfully participate and get to know each other in a way that they may not otherwise. So a couple of examples: if it's a birthday party, virtual birthday party, to invite each guest to bring with them like a sweet, a drink, a hat of their choice, and a story of a value or a quality or a trait that the birthday girl or birthday boy hold, and how they know that. And invite each person to share a story, and again, you're going to have like a chief like birthday facilitator, and it shouldn't be the birthday girl or boy, to actually, when you ask people stories that relate to the person, they're interesting not just because you're saying, oh, this person's so great, but it's actually giving a lot of people context about the person, but also about your relationship to them. And so find ways to have people come together and each have a moment to share something related to the person. But again, through a story, not necessarily advice or an opinion, because stories have legs. Stories are easy to listen to. Stories also have a lot of data in them that very few other vessels do.
That's really great. This has been so wonderful, Priya. I feel like I know that I'm really excited to try some of these tools and tips that you've offered, and these suggestions, I think, will really help sustain a lot of people through these next few weeks and months and beyond as we come out of this. So I think before we end, I'd just love to give you an opportunity to share any sort of parting thoughts you have about your really big takeaways from what we should take from this moment as we think about connecting in meaningful ways.
I think that we are all in the coming weeks and months going to be hosts of many new types of gatherings and guests of many new types of gatherings. And as we do, we have an opportunity in each of these moments to not go on autopilot, which is often one of the dangers of our in-person gatherings, and to ask for every gathering, like, why are we doing this? Do we still need to do this now? What is essential to preserve, and how do we give life to it in this new medium? I think to think about power dynamics and to ask, what are you actually asking of people in this moment? And is it too much? This pandemic will weigh on us in different ways, unequally. And so as you're beginning to think about how and what do we mark, how do you ask and what do you expect from different people given a very difficult and dire time? And again, I'll say what I said earlier, which is we really inspire each other through through specific examples of invention. And so as you try out new things, and also in the work context, as you think about what is it that actually makes meetings work and meaningful, experimenting with shortening the time of meetings, experimenting with spending more time on checking in, and perhaps only having meetings for decision making and not doing meetings for anything else, like to actually start really sharing lessons with one another, and to please share your examples with me, because I learn every time I hear of ways that wherever people are in the world, they're inventing new ways of coming together in ways that communities need.
Thank you so much, Priya. This has been wonderful, and I really appreciate you taking the time to chat, and sending best wishes to you and all of your loved ones to stay safe and healthy during this time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and be well.